Niagara Falls suburb of Lewiston, New York. Late November, 1968. The morning is the color of wet concrete on a quiet street called Dana Drive. For houses sit side by side, set back from the road, unremarkable, brick, tidy lawns. Nothing about them suggests they belong to anyone of consequence. A milk truck could pass this block 1,000 times and never slow down. Federal cars are already parked at the curb. Agents move up the walk to the third house without announcing themselves the way television has taught you to expect. There is no shouting. There is barely any sound at all. Just men in overcoats closing on a door that has never, in 50 years, had reason to be afraid of a knock. Inside, an old man in his 70s is finishing breakfast. He has run the most secretive criminal organization in the eastern United States for longer than most of the agents outside have been alive. Longer, in fact, than any mafia boss in American history. Al Capone became a household name and was gone within a decade. Lucky Luciano was deported. This man has simply never been famous enough to fall. The knock comes, and when it is answered and the agents identify themselves, and the search warrant is read aloud in that flat government cadence, something happens on the old man's face. He staggers. He reaches for the wall. He goes down onto the kitchen floor, clutching his chest, gasping for air in front of federal officers who suddenly aren't sure whether they're witnessing an arrest or a death. Somebody calls for a doctor. Whether this is the end of Stefano Magaddino or merely his last trick is a question we're going to leave sitting on that kitchen floor for now. Because to understand what's really happening in that house on Dana Drive and why it took the United States government the better part of half a century to walk through that door, you have to go back. Back past the funeral home. Back past the commission. Back past the bombs, the grenades, the bootleg whiskey crossing a frozen river in the dark. Back to a killing in Sicily in 1916, and a young man who decided that the only way to survive in his world was to make sure nobody ever really saw him coming. This is the story of the Buffalo crime family. 50 years, one man, and an empire so quiet that half the country it was built inside never learned it existed at all. They called him the Undertaker. This is why, before we go further, drop where you're watching this from and what time it is right where you are, right now. I read every single one of these, and it's wild seeing how far this stuff travels. And if you're the kind of person who's into stories about people who built entire empires nobody was even supposed to know existed, do me a solid. Hit like, get subscribed. And if there's one person in your life who'd appreciate a nearly 3-hour deep dive into the most powerful American crime boss you've probably never heard of, send them this video right now. Because trust me, by the end of this you'll understand exactly why hardly anybody has. Okay, Sicily, a fishing town on a blue bay. 1916. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. To understand Stefano Magaddino, you first have to understand the town that made him, and the peculiar, brutal economy of loyalty that governed it centuries before anyone in America had ever heard the word mafia. Castellamare del Golfo sits on the northwestern coast of Sicily, wrapped around a curve of blue water, backed by dry hills terraced with olive trees and vineyards. To a tourist, it looks like nothing more than a postcard. But beneath the postcard, for generations, this one small town had been quietly exporting something else to the United States, decade after decade, in wave after wave of immigration. Men raised from childhood inside a code of family loyalty, blood obligation, and violent reprisal, so complete it functioned less like a set of rules and more like a second language. Historians of organized crime sometimes joke, with only a little exaggeration, that more American Mafia bosses trace their roots to Castellamare del Golfo than any single city in Sicily many times its size. The Bananos, the Buccellatos, the Magaddinos, all from the same few streets around the same small harbor. Stefano Magaddino was born there on October 10th, 1891, into a family that was already woven into the town's underworld structure before he could walk. His father, Giovanni Magaddino, was the brother of a man who would become critically important to the entire arc of the story. Joseph Bonanno's maternal grandmother's family line ran directly through the same clan. His uncle, also named Stefano, led one of the town's rival Castellamarese factions, allied by blood and marriage to Giuseppe Pepe Bonanno and his brother, a partnership sealed not through business contracts, but through generations of intermarriage, godparenthood, and sheer vendetta. The clans of Castellamare del Golfo didn't simply coexist with one another. Through the early 1900s, they feuded, most notably with a rival faction led by Felice Buccellato, in cycles of violence and reconciliation that stretched back further than anyone still living could accurately recount. Young Stefano Magaddino grew up fluent in that language of obligation and reprisal before he ever learned to speak of anything so bureaucratic as organized crime. He crossed the Atlantic for the first time as a teenager, arriving in New York City around 1902, and fell in almost immediately with the established Castellamarese clan already rooted in Brooklyn. Men from his own town, speaking his own dialect, bound in by the same web of family loyalty that had structured his entire childhood. It was on its surface an ordinary immigrant path. A young Sicilian finding his countrymen in a new city, learning English in fits and starts, working, absorbing the rhythms of American life. Underneath that surface, he was apprenticing himself to a criminal tradition that had simply crossed the ocean along with the wine bottles, the family photographs, and the grudges nobody back home had ever quite let go of. For more than a decade, Stefano Magaddino existed mostly in the background of a Brooklyn underworld that was still finding its shape, not yet organized into the disciplined hierarchy of families and captains that would define it by the 1930s, but a looser, more fluid patchwork of clan loyalties, protection rackets, and periodic outbreaks of violence between factions who all, in one way or another, trace their roots back to the same handful of Sicilian towns. Then, in 1916, an event 4,000 miles away reached across the ocean and permanently redirected the course of his life. That year, in Castellammare del Golfo, a fresh eruption of gangland violence took the life of Magaddino's own brother, Pietro. A man named Camillo Cazzo was believed to have had a hand in the killing. In the moral universe Stefano Magaddino had been raised inside, a universe with its own private legal code, its own courts, its own executioners. This was not a matter that could be resolved through Sicilian police. It was not a matter that grief alone could settle. It was a debt, and debts of this particular kind, in this particular world, did not expire simply because the debtor crossed an ocean to escape them. Cazzo fled Sicily for New York, apparently believing that 3,000 miles of open water offered real protection. It didn't. In 1921, 5 years after Pietro Magaddino's murder, Cazzo's body was pulled from a cove of the Shark River in New Jersey. The man who confessed to the killing, Bartolomeo Fontana, told police under interrogation that he had been forced into the act by a loose network of Castellamarese mafiosi operating in America who called themselves, with a certain grim internal theater, the Good Killers, men bound together by exactly the same blood vendetta logic that had claimed Pietro Magaddino's life 5 years earlier on the other side of the ocean. Stefano Magaddino was pulled directly into the resulting investigation. According to later court testimony, he agreed to meet Fontana at Grand Central Station in Manhattan and handed him $30, enough at the time to help a man disappear for a while. In the accounting of the old country, this was Magaddino settling his brother's account, one final gesture, closing a debt that had taken 5 years to collect. But the meeting was a trap. Undercover police officers were watching, and Magaddino was arrested on the spot alongside several other men connected to Cazzo's death. Fontana, talking now to save his own neck, kept talking well past a single killing he confessed to, opening the door onto a string of other unsolved good killers' murders it had, until that moment, gone entirely unexplained. In the end, the case against Magaddino himself collapsed. New Jersey authorities ultimately declined to pursue conspiracy charges, and despite the sworn testimony of the arresting New York police officers directly tying him to the sting operation at Grand Central Station, the charges against Stefano Magaddino were formally dropped. Legally, he walked away a free man. But New York City, by 1921, was no longer a place he could comfortably operate in. Too many eyes on him now, too much recent heat, too many law enforcement officials who could now put a name and a face to exactly the kind of man Stefano Magaddino had become. So he left, and in doing so, at 30 years old, with no particular grand design in mind beyond simple survival, he made the single most consequential strategic decision of his entire career. Though nobody, least of all Magaddino himself, could possibly have understood that at the time, he went west into western New York State, to a mid-sized industrial city on the shore of Lake Erie called Buffalo, and to its smaller, stranger, more peculiar neighbor 18 miles to the north, Niagara Falls, where American honeymooners and international tourists came in their thousands every summer to gawk at one of the natural wonders of the world, and where, conveniently for a man in Magaddino's line of work, the Niagara River formed a long, meandering, easily crossed border with Canada. Buffalo already had a mafia presence, though a modest one by the standards being set in New York and Chicago. Around the turn of the century, a man named Angelo Palmieri, known locally as Buffalo Bill, had emerged as the city's first genuine mafia boss, building a small but functional criminal organization out of the city's growing Italian immigrant neighborhoods. By 1912, Palmieri had stepped back into the underboss and eventually consigliere role, and a man named Joseph Joe the Wolf DiCarlo took over as boss, running Buffalo's underworld with a steady, unspectacular hand to the tail end of the pre-Prohibition era and into the early 1920s. DiCarlo's help began failing in the early 1920s. As his grip on the organization loosened, the Castellamarese faction embedded within his ranks. Men who shared Magaddino's Sicilian hometown, his network of blood and marriage loyalties, and increasingly, his growing national reputation, began quietly looking for a strong replacement. Magaddino was already well known in Brooklyn, in Philadelphia, in Chicago. He'd traveled through western New York before on organizational business, and had built a warm, respectful relationship with the ailing DiCarlo. He was, according to several historical accounts, genuinely reluctant at first to accept the post. Buffalo was not New York. It was not where the glamour and gravitational pull of real underworld power was supposed to be found. But the men pressing him were persuasive. DiCarlo's decline was accelerating, and by 1922, when DiCarlo finally died, Stefano Magaddino accepted the role of boss of the Buffalo family. He was 30 years old, and he had just inherited command of an entire regional criminal underworld. He purchased property in Niagara Falls and began construction on a home there, a modest, deliberate signal to the men now beneath him that he intended to put down permanent roots, not simply pass through as a caretaker administrator. He brought his own brother, Antonino, over from Sicily to serve as a trusted advisor inside his new inner circle. Two established Castellamarese men who had served under DiCarlo, Angelo Palmieri and a lieutenant named Filippo Mazzara, were given direct oversight of day-to-day operations inside Buffalo proper, while Magaddino built his own permanent headquarters up in Niagara Falls, close enough to the city to command it decisively, far enough removed from its daily street-level friction to stay insulated from the kind of visible entanglements that had chased him out of New York in the first place. In 1924, he was naturalized as a citizen of the United States. On paper, he was simply another immigrant success story of the era, a young Sicilian who had come to America with almost nothing and built a stable, respectable life for himself in a growing industrial city. Underneath that paper trail, he had just quietly inherited control of an entire regional underworld. At precisely the moment American history was about to hand men exactly like him the single greatest business opportunity of the entire 20th century. In January 1920, the United States enacted nationwide prohibition, outlawing the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages across the country. It was from the cold, purely economic perspective of organized crime, the single most consequential piece of federal legislation ever passed in American history, an overnight creation of an enormous black market, handed gift wrap to whoever possessed the nerve, the manpower, and the geographic positioning to fill it. Nobody in the entire country was positioned better than Stefano Magaddino. Directly across the Niagara River sat the Canadian province of Ontario, where alcohol production and sale remained perfectly legal, where distilleries and breweries kept running at full industrial capacity, manufacturing product with an entire nation to its south now suddenly forbidden to consume it legally. The river separating Ontario from Niagara Falls, New York, narrows in places to only a few hundred yards. At night, in small motorboats slipping past patchy patrol coverage, across the ice in the depths of winter when the river's surface would freeze solid enough to bear a man's weight and, occasionally, a loaded sled through the tunnels connecting basements on either side of certain border crossings, and by truck across the bridges linking the two countries with the help of customs officials paid handsomely to wave the right vehicles through without inspection. Canadian whiskey, wine, and beer flowed south into western New York in a volume that transformed the entire Niagara Falls economy. a town whose commercial identity had been built almost entirely on tourism and honeymoon romance became, within a few short years, one of the most efficient and profitable smuggling corridors anywhere in North America. Magaddino organized it. This, more than any single act of violence, more than any single business deal, was his true genius, and it would remain his defining genius for the next 5 decades, not inventing anything genuinely new about the bootlegging trade, and not outmuscling his rivals through spectacular, headline-generating violence, but building systems. Quiet, disciplined, endlessly repeatable systems that move product and money across an international border without ever drawing the kind of sustained attention that destroyed lesser operators. Buffalo's speakeasy stayed reliably stocked, week after week, without the supply interruptions and turf disputes that plague less organized cities. Niagara Falls' tourist strip, described at the time with a certain wry local candor as honky-tonk, roared along night after night on illegal liquor Magaddino's organization brought across the water with almost industrial regularity. The profits generated were extraordinary, and unlike Chicago, where Al Capone and his rivals waged a very public, very bloody war for control of essentially the identical racket, littering the streets with enough bodies to permanently install Capone's face in the American public imagination, Buffalo's bootlegging operation ran with a level of internal discipline that kept it almost entirely off the front page of any newspaper outside Western New York. That single contrast is the whole story of Stefano Magaddino in miniature, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because everything that follows in this documentary flows directly out of it. Al Capone became the most famous criminal in the entire world, and was sitting in federal prison by 1932, convicted not of murder, not of bootlegging, not of any crimes that actually built his empire, but of tax evasion, undone in the end not by a rival gang, but by his own inescapable visibility. Magaddino watched all of this unfold from 400 miles away, and by every indication in the historical record, he absorbed the lesson permanently and completely. Fame was never power. Fame, in this particular line of work, was exposure wearing power's clothing, and exposure, sooner or later, was a death sentence with an unusually long fuse. Every serious criminal operation of Magaddino's era needed a legitimate face. A business a man could point to when a curious neighbor, a suspicious tax collector, or an inquisitive police detective asked the obvious question: where exactly does your money come from? Magaddino's answer to that question was, in hindsight, almost too perfect to be believed, the kind of detail that would feel contrived in a work of fiction. He went into the business of burying the dead. He established the Magaddino Memorial Chapel in Niagara Falls, a legitimate, fully functioning funeral parlor that would go on to handle real grief for real local families for decades, employing real staff, filing real tax returns, embalming real bodies with the same professional care as any funeral home in America. It gave him a business with a plausible, verifiable cash flow. It gave him a location where men could gather quietly at any hour without arousing suspicion. Because what, after all, is more natural in a small city than mourners visiting a funeral home late in the evening or early in the morning, or in the strange dead hours between viewings when a black sedan parked outside draws no curious second glance from anyone. And eventually, inevitably, it gave him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, and into every history book ever written about him afterward: the Undertaker. There is something almost too tidy about it, told this way. Dramatically speaking, a man who deals professionally in death by day, quietly orchestrating it by night. But by every account from historians who have studied the man closely, it was never theater. It was strategy, calculated and deliberate, in exactly the way everything else about Magaddino's career would prove to be. The funeral home gave him a permanent, respectable, entirely unimpeachable public identity in a small city where sooner or later, every single family needs an Undertaker, and where nobody, not police, not reporters, not curious neighbors, thinks twice about a hearse idling at the curb or a dark sedan parked outside a funeral parlor at any hour of the day or night, around the chapel. Over the following years, he built out an entire portfolio of additional legitimate-looking enterprises. A distributing company called Power City Distributing. Its name a wink at Niagara Falls' identity as a hub of hydroelectric power. A linen supply business. The Camellia Linen Supply Company, that served the laundry needs of most of the hotels lining the busy Niagara Falls tourist corridor, a business with genuine, ongoing commercial relationships that gave Magaddino's organization legitimate reasons to move trucks, personnel, and cash flow through the tourist district on a daily basis. Taxi cab companies, which offer both real transportation revenue and, not incidentally, a discreet, unremarkable fleet of vehicles that can move men and materials around the region without ever standing out. Every single one of these ventures served double duty. Real income, real employees, real filed tax returns on the surface. And beneath that surface cover logistics and laundering capacity for the far larger river money that never touched a filing cabinet anywhere. He also built out political infrastructure with the same patient, methodical care. Where Al Capone bought Chicago aldermen with blunt cash payments and open threats in a manner that eventually blew up into public scandal, Magaddino cultivated his relationships more slowly, more carefully, spread across years rather than transactions, local officials, police contacts, and critically, a consigliere named John C. Montana. Montana was a genuine Buffalo insider, a respected local businessman who ran a legitimate taxi and limousine service, and a former Buffalo City councilman whose public civic career gave Magaddino's organization a real, working bridge into the city's actual legitimate establishment. It was the kind of protection that could never be purchased in a single transaction. It had to be built, favor by favor, relationship by relationship, election cycle after election cycle, over the better part of a decade. And once built, it would prove nearly impossible for outside investigators to fully map or dismantle. Prohibition was repealed in December 1933, ratified by the 21st Amendment. For bootleggers whose entire fortune had been built exclusively on smuggled liquor, this should have been an existential shock. The overnight legalization of the very product their entire criminal economy had been organized around. Magaddino barely blinked. His organization had never actually been built around a single racket. It had been built, from the very beginning, around infrastructure, smuggling routes across an international border, a network of corrupted or cooperative officials, disciplined manpower accustomed to following instructions without asking unnecessary questions, and a growing web of laundering fronts capable of absorbing large volumes of cash without triggering suspicion. Infrastructure of that kind is endlessly reusable. When liquor stopped being profitable to smuggle across the Niagara River, the same routes, the same trucks, the same relationships with cooperative border officials pivoted smoothly and almost immediately into a new generation of rackets. Illegal gambling operations run out of social clubs and back rooms across the region, loan sharking at usurious interest rates that trap working men in debts they could never realistically escape, extortion of local businesses under the ever-present threat of the very violence Magaddino preferred never to actually display in public, and, increasingly as the 1930s wore on, control of organized labor, most significantly Local 210 of the Labor's International Union of North America in Buffalo, which handed the family direct leverage over hiring, over construction contracts, over entire sectors of the region's legitimate economy that had nothing whatsoever to do with liquor, gambling, or any traditionally understood vice. By the mid-1930s, Stefano Magaddino, still barely into his 40s, controlled a criminal organization stretching well beyond Buffalo city limits, into Rochester, into Utica, along the entire industrial corridor of upstate New York, and increasingly, with growing confidence, across the international border into southern Ontario. He had built all of this without ever becoming a household name, without a single tabloid headline attached to his own face, without the kind of sustained national publicity that already, by this point, ended the careers of far more famous men than he would ever choose to become. And in 1931, in the very year the entire American Mafia was about to be violently and permanently reorganized from the top down, Stefano Magaddino was about to be handed something that would cement his personal power for the remainder of his life, a founding seat at the very top of the newly reconstituted national organization. That's where we're headed next. The birth of the commission, and the extraordinary moment when a quiet boss from a supposedly secondary city found himself seated, by right and by reputation, among the single most powerful criminals in the entire United States. By 1930, New York City's mafia underworld was hurtling toward open, citywide war. Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria had positioned himself as the dominant power broker among the city's various Italian-American criminal factions, and he expected unconditional tribute and obedience from smaller organizations around the country, Buffalo very much included. Masuria had come to view the Castellamarese network, that tightly bonded web of men who trace their roots back to that single Sicilian coastal town, spread now across half a dozen American cities, as a rival power base, a threat to his own authority that needed to be broken decisively before it could organize itself into genuine opposition. Magaddino, as one of the most established and well-connected Castellamarese bosses operating outside New York City itself, found himself pulled directly into what would come to be known, in the histories written decades later, as the Castellamarese War, a bloody, sprawling conflict fought largely in the streets of New York between Masuria's forces and the rising challenger Salvatore Maranzano, a fellow Sicilian who had emerged as the natural rallying figure for the entire Castellamarese faction nationwide. Magaddino backed Maranzano without hesitation. He sent money south from Buffalo. He sent trusted men south to fight in a conflict he had every practical reason to want to see resolved in his own faction's favor, because a genuine Castellamarese victory in New York meant the survival, and likely the elevation, of his entire extended network of allegiance, family, and shared obligation. Masuria was assassinated in the spring of 1931, famously gunned down at a Coney Island restaurant, reportedly abandoned mid-card game by his own trusted bodyguard, a rising young lieutenant named Charles Lucky Luciano, whose own ambitions were only just beginning to reveal themselves. With Masuria dead, Maranzano declared himself boss of bosses, capo di tutti capi, a supreme, singular authority over the entire American Mafia nationwide, a title carrying unmistakably imperial overtones that almost immediately began chafing against the instinct of the very allies who had just helped put him in power. Magaddino's relationship with Maranzano soured almost as quickly as it had first solidified during the war. Maranzano began demanding regular tribute payments from crime families all across the country, positioning himself less as first among equals within a council of respected peers, and more as an actual reigning monarch of American organized crime. That kind of centralized, deeply personal concentration of authority was precisely the vulnerability the Mafia's older, more experienced generation of leadership had just spent an entire brutal year learning, through direct and bloody experience, to distrust above almost anything else. Men who had only just finished fighting a war against one boss's runaway personal ambition were in no mood, only months later, to simply bow their heads to another's. Maranzano was assassinated that September, reportedly by a crew of men working under Luciano's direction, several of them disguised as government agents, gunned down inside his own Manhattan real estate office in a killing that echoed, with grim symmetry, the same betrayal from within tactic that had claimed Masuria only months earlier. And with Maranzano's death, the American Mafia made a structural decision that would go on to define organized crime in the United States for the remainder of the 20th century. Rather than simply replacing one supreme boss of bosses with another and risking the same cycle of ambition and assassination indefinitely, the country's leading mafia figures abolished the position entirely, replacing it with something closer, in structure and spirit, to a permanent governing council. That council was a commission, a body deliberately created to arbitrate disputes between rival families, to formally sanction major decisions affecting the organization nationwide, and above all, to prevent exactly the kind of destructive, headline-generating warfare that had just consumed New York City for the better part of an entire year, dragging outside law enforcement attention along with it. It was not, by design, a monarchy. It was, in its own dark and pragmatic way, something much closer to a corporate board of directors, with formal seats allocated to the heads of the most powerful and most consistently respected families in the country. Stefano Magaddino was one of the original members given a permanent seat. It's genuinely worth pausing here on how unusual that actually was. Nearly every other founding commission seat went to bosses based directly in New York City. Men who controlled organizations vastly larger, in sheer raw numbers of soldiers and captains, than Magaddino's comparatively modest regional operation up in Buffalo. Buffalo was not New York. It was not Chicago. By almost any conventional national standard, it was a secondary market, a regional outpost rather than a genuine center of underworld power. And yet Magaddino sat at that founding table as a full and equal member, a testament, historians generally agree, to two separate but related things: the deep generational respect his Castellamarese lineage and wartime loyalty commanded among his peers, and the simple, undeniable financial fact that his bootlegging empire, built quietly and almost entirely out of public view, had made him one of the wealthiest and most operationally stable criminal figures in the entire national underworld. There's a telling footnote worth including here, because it says something important about how these founding commission seats were actually allocated in practice. Historical accounts suggest Magaddino secured a particular seat, at least in part, because Cleveland's own boss, Frank Milano, had disgraced himself in the eyes of his peers by seeming to approve, or at least tolerate, a string of internal murders among Pittsburgh's underworld leadership. Commission seats, in other words, were never handed out purely on the basis of an organization's raw size. They were handed out fundamentally on the basis of trust. Specifically, the ability to be relied upon not to start the kind of internal wars that would inevitably drag every other family into precisely the sort of unwanted federal and state scrutiny the entire commission had just been created to avoid. Magaddino's entire career, both before this moment and for 4 remaining decades that followed it, would stand as a living demonstration of exactly that particular quality: discipline, reliability, and a studied, almost obsessive avoidance of unnecessary chaos. Magaddino's single most important ally on the newly formed commission wasn't some New York City power broker he'd only recently come to know through wartime necessity. It was his own nephew, Joseph Bonanno, a fellow son of Castellamare del Golfo, tied to Magaddino by blood through generations of careful intermarriage between their 2 allied clans, rose in the years following the Castellamarese War to become boss of what would go on to be known as the Bonanno crime family, one of New York City's Story 5 families. He and Magaddino entered the newly formed commission as, in effect, a single coordinated block. 2 men from the same small Sicilian coastal town, bound together by family loyalty that had existed generations before the American Mafia's very institutional structure had even come into being. The commission's very first significant piece of business, fittingly, involved carving up new criminal territory between uncle and nephew directly. Canada, specifically the smuggling-rich, rackets-friendly provinces of Ontario and Quebec, represented enormously lucrative, largely uncontested ground sitting just across 2 separate borders from 2 separate American power bases. The Commission decided, in one of its earliest formal rulings, that Magaddino's Buffalo organization would control Ontario, leveraging its already established bootlegging infrastructure across the Niagara River and its growing relationships in Toronto and Hamilton. Bonanno's New York-based organization, meanwhile, would control Quebec, leveraging its own developing access into Montreal. This particular territorial division mattered enormously, and its consequences would echo across every remaining decade of Magaddino's career, and remarkably, into events unfolding well beyond his own lifetime, into the 21st century itself. Ontario became, in effect, a permanent second theater of operations for the Buffalo family, an extension of Magaddino's core territory that stretched his influence across an international border in a way no purely domestic American organization could easily match or challenge. Canadian law enforcement, working for decades under an entirely different legal system, with entirely different institutional resources, priorities, and legal thresholds than the American FBI, struggled repeatedly to make any lasting dent in the cross-border relationships Magaddino's organization patiently cultivated in cities like Toronto and Hamilton, relationships forged directly with Canadian-based organized crime figures, most notably families like the Papalias and later the Valpes, who found in Buffalo a stable, wealthy, and reliably discreet American partner, sitting just across a river most of their own product had already crossed once before. Buffalo's remoteness, the very quality that had once felt, to a younger, more ambitious Magaddino, like a kind of professional demotion from the glamour and centrality of New York City, turned out, once he'd actually settled into the role of boss, to be one of the single greatest structural advantages within the newly formed commission itself. Because Magaddino was not based in New York City, he was not, in any meaningful sense, a direct territorial competitor to any of the 5 families jostling constantly for advantage in the country's largest and most lucrative criminal marketplace. He had no obvious personal stake in their endless internal rivalries, no competing claim on their turf, no accumulated decades of grudges arising from constant, unavoidable proximity and friction. That geographic neutrality made him a genuinely natural arbitrator whenever disputes broke out. When conflicts erupted between New York-based families, over contested territory, over disputed rackets, over insults real, exaggerated, or entirely imagined. Magaddino was frequently called upon by his fellow commission members to help mediate, precisely because of physical and organizational distance separating him from the conflict gave him a credible claim to impartiality that no Brooklyn or Manhattan-based boss could ever plausibly maintain. This particular role suited him perfectly because it reinforced exactly the persona he had already spent his entire career quietly and deliberately cultivating: the reasonable man, the patient elder statesman, the boss who solved problems rather than manufactured new ones. Where rival bosses built their reputations on fear generated through visible, demonstrable acts of violence, Magaddino built his own reputation, year after year, on being genuinely useful, a man whose word could be trusted to settle a dispute cleanly and permanently, without dragging every family involved into the kind of extended, headline-generating war that would inevitably draw unwanted federal attention down on the entire national organization. And attention, by the mid-1930s, was steadily becoming a genuinely dangerous thing to attract. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI remained, at this particular stage of its institutional development, largely uninterested in organized crime as a coordinated, nationwide phenomenon, a striking institutional blind spot that will persist for another 2 decades, all the way until an event we'll cover in full later in this documentary finally forced Hoover's hand. But state and local law enforcement, along with more aggressive federal agencies like the Bureau of Narcotics, were becoming increasingly assertive across this same period. A boss who kept his operation genuinely quiet, who avoided the kind of tabloid infamy that had eventually buried Capone, who settled inter-family disputes calmly through the commission rather than through open gunfire in the street, was, quite simply, a boss who survived. Magaddino understood this instinctively, almost as a kind of second nature, and it shaped every single major decision he would go on to make for the next 4 decades of his life. In December 1946, Magaddino's growing standing within the National Commission carried him to one of the most consequential and lavish underworld gatherings of the entire 20th century. The Havana Conference, convened at the elegant Hotel Nacional in Havana, Cuba. The ostensible public occasion was a welcome home celebration for the singer Frank Sinatra, whose recording career was then rapidly ascending, a glamorous, entirely convenient cover story for what was, underneath the nightclub shows and the cigars and the champagne, a genuine, closed-door summit of American organized crime's most powerful national figures. Lucky Luciano, deported to Italy from the United States only the previous year as a reward, in part, for his wartime cooperation with naval intelligence, was present in Havana anyway, using the gathering to publicly reassert an underworld influence he'd technically been legally exiled from exercising. Meyer Lansky, the financial architect behind much of the Mafia's growing casino and gambling infrastructure, was there too. Bosses and senior lieutenants from New York, from New Jersey, from cities across the entire country converged on Havana that December, all of them moving under the convenient public cover of a famous singer's celebratory homecoming. Magaddino's presence at Havana confirmed something genuinely important about exactly where he now stood within the national hierarchy. This was not a man confined to some regional fiefdom tucked away in the far corner of upstate New York. This was a boss who unquestionably belonged in a room whenever the entire national leadership of American organized crime gathered to quietly discuss the future direction of their business, the enormous post-war expansion potential of Cuban casino gambling, the always politically delicate question of the narcotics trade, and precisely which families would be formally permitted to touch it and which would not, and the broader post-war reorganization of an underworld economy that had shifted dramatically over the previous half-decade of global war. By the late 1940s and moving into the 1950s, Magaddino's operation had grown considerably beyond its original Prohibition-era foundations. His organization now touched illegal gambling operations spread across upstate New York, extensive loan sharking networks reaching deep into working-class immigrant neighborhoods, labor racketeering channeled through Local 210, and increasingly sophisticated cross-border rackets running through his commission-sanctioned Ontario territory into Toronto and Hamilton. There is also documented evidence, cited repeatedly by historians studying this period, tying Magaddino's organization, working in close coordination with the Hamilton-based Papalia crime family, to the unsolved 1944 disappearance of Rocco Perry, a notorious and long-established Canadian bootlegger whose sudden, permanent removal conveniently, and perhaps not coincidentally, expanded the Buffalo family's own grip on the lucrative Canadian liquor and gambling markets, sitting just across the border to the north. He had, in other words, become exactly what he had originally set out back in 1922 to become. Not remotely the most famous man in American organized crime, but arguably one of the most genuinely secure, sitting comfortably atop a criminal empire that by now stretched from Ohio all the way to Ontario and into Quebec, protected by carefully cultivated political relationships, insulated by geography and by his own deliberate remoteness, and governed throughout by a code of internal discipline that had, so far, successfully kept the very worst of law enforcement's national attention pointed decisively elsewhere. But security, in a business fundamentally built on violence, on blood debts, and on the loyalty of men whose obedience could always, under the right pressure, be bought or broken, is never truly absolute. And in the years immediately ahead, Stefano Magaddino would learn, twice, in the most direct, personal, and unmistakably terrifying way imaginable, exactly how fragile that hard-won security actually was. For all his carefully cultivated reputation as a quiet, diplomatic boss, the elder statesman who preferred patient arbitration to open warfare, Stefano Magaddino did not build and successfully hold an entire criminal empire for 50 consecutive years through kindness alone. His organization enforced its rackets, and particularly its systematic taxation of independent gambling operators working within his territory, with exactly the same underlying ruthlessness as any other major mafia family operating anywhere in the country during this period. The real difference was never mercy. It was visibility. And Magaddino had simply become the acknowledged master of controlling one while never sacrificing the other. By the mid-1930s, with national prohibition now firmly over and illegal gambling rapidly emerging as the family's dominant single source of revenue, Magaddino instituted what amounted functionally to a mandatory tax. Independent bookmakers and gambling operators running anywhere within his recognized territory were expected to pay regular tribute for the ongoing privilege of operating without violent outside interference. It was, in effect, a classic protection racket layered directly over an already existing criminal economy. And like nearly every protection racket in history, it depended entirely on the credible, ever-present threat of serious violence directed against anyone foolish enough to refuse payment. In 1936, a loosely organized group of independent bookmakers decided, collectively, that they had finally had enough. They organized active resistance against Magaddino's gambling tax, flatly refusing payment, pushing back hard against an arrangement that had governed Buffalo's entire gambling economy, largely unchallenged, for well over a decade. The retaliation, when it finally came, did not land anywhere near where anyone, least of all Magaddino himself, could possibly have expected or wanted it to. A bomb exploded at the home of Magaddino's own sister. The precise details of exactly who planted the device, and exactly what specific message it was ultimately intended to convey, have been debated by historians studying this period for the better part of a century now. Whether the bomb had been aimed squarely at Magaddino himself and simply missed its intended target through sheer chance of timing, or whether it represented instead a broader, more diffuse act of intimidation directed against his entire extended family network, meant to demonstrate that no one connected to him, however peripherally, was truly beyond reach. What is not remotely in dispute, however, is the devastating outcome. Magaddino's sister was killed in the blast, inside her own home, in an act of calculated violence unmistakably connected to the ongoing rebellion of independent bookmakers against his taxation authority. For a boss who had spent his entire adult career carefully constructing an operating philosophy built almost entirely around minimizing visible violence, around keeping Buffalo's underworld quiet, disciplined, and deliberately unremarkable in a way that pointedly avoided the kind of endless gang war headlines that had already consumed and ultimately destroyed Chicago's underworld leadership. This was a genuinely devastating and intensely personal violation, an attack that had somehow reached straight past every single layer of protection he had methodically built over more than a decade, and had taken the life of a member of his own immediate family in the process. The response that followed was systematic, patient, and, over the course of the following full year, thorough almost beyond description. The identified leaders of the rebel bookmaking organization were, one after another, methodically hunted down and killed. There was no negotiated settlement offered. There was no face-saving compromise tax rate quietly extended as a peace gesture. The specific men who had organized active resistance against Magaddino's authority were eliminated entirely, and the resulting message, delivered not through any single public spectacle designed to grab headlines, but instead through a steady, extended string of quiet disappearances and killings absorbed almost entirely within the underworld's own private channels, never once generating the kind of tabloid narrative that had already turned other American bosses into instantly recognizable national symbols of gangland violence, reestablished in the starkest and most unambiguous terms imaginable, exactly what awaited anyone who dared challenge Magaddino's authority directly. It is worth sitting for a moment with the sheer contrast on display here, because it sits at the very center of understanding how Magaddino actually operated across the whole of his 50-year reign. The killing of his own sister had been public, dramatic, and genuinely impossible for anyone in the region to fully ignore. His response to it was a precise opposite in every respect, methodical, deliberately drawn out over the better part of a year, absorbed almost entirely within tightly controlled underworld channels, never once generating the kind of sensational public narrative that turned other mafia bosses into household names synonymous with gangland bloodshed. Even Magaddino's revenge, in the end, was quiet. While Magaddino's own organization continued expanding steadily through the post-war 1940s and into 1950s, a slower, more institutional threat was beginning to take shape in Washington, one that would take years to fully mature, but that would eventually intersect directly with events unfolding in Buffalo. Throughout the late 1950s, the United States Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, known popularly after its chairman, Senator John McClellan, as the McClellan Committee, began holding a lengthy, nationally televised series of hearings investigating organized crime's deepening infiltration of American labor unions. A young committee counsel named Robert Kennedy, working alongside his brother, then Senator John F. Kennedy, used these hearings to build the first genuinely comprehensive public record of how deeply organized crime had penetrated legitimate American institutions, including directly and specifically Buffalo's own Local 210, the very union local Magaddino's organization, had spent 2 decades quietly bringing under its control. The committee's investigators, working through 1963, formally identified Magaddino's Lieutenant John Camilleri as a documented Buffalo family figure on organizational charts, prepared specifically for McClellan Committee's continuing work, a level of official federal documentation that Magaddino's organization had successfully avoided for the better part of 4 decades up to that point. That same year, 1963, brought an even more direct threat to the entire National Commission structure Magaddino had helped establish 3 decades earlier. Joseph Apalachin, a low-ranking soldier in New York's Genovese family, facing life imprisonment on an unrelated murder charge, agreed to testify publicly before Congress about the internal structure and operations of the American Mafia, becoming, in the process, the first mafia insider in history to speak openly and on the public record about the organization's existence, its rules, and its internal terminology, including the very term Cosa Nostra that would enter the American public vocabulary permanently in the aftermath. Apalachin's testimony did not implicate Magaddino directly or extensively. His own career had unfolded almost entirely within New York City's Genovese organization, far from Buffalo's own internal affairs. But it confirmed on the public congressional record and in front of national television cameras something federal investigators had suspected for years and that Magaddino's own operational discipline had helped obscure for decades, that the country's various regional crime families were not simply loosely affiliated local gangs operating independently of one another, but were bound together by a formal national governing structure, the very commission Magaddino himself had helped found in 1931, and on which he continued in 1963, to hold one of the longest tenured seats of any living boss in the country. The walls, in other words, were beginning to close and slowly, methodically, from multiple directions at once. Congressional hearings in Washington, an increasingly aggressive Bureau of Narcotics, and a federal Bureau of Investigation that, while still institutionally reluctant under Hoover to fully commit its resources to organized crime, was nonetheless beginning, case by case, to build the kind of coordinated national picture that had simply never existed before. Magaddino, characteristically, showed almost no outward sign of concern. He had, after all, survived worse. Which brings us to the second attempt on his life, one that arrived not from a rebellious faction of independent bookmakers, but from within the Mafia's own national leadership, in the bitter, blame-soaked aftermath of an event we're about to cover in full, the catastrophic 1957 Apalachin Conference. In the immediate aftermath of that disaster, which we'll walk through scene by scene in the next act, blame within the Underworld's own tightly wound hierarchy landed heavily, and specifically on Stefano Magaddino. It had been Magaddino, after all, who personally proposed a fateful location, steering his fellow commission bosses toward the rural Pennsylvania estate of his longtime associate Joseph Barber, rather than the meeting's original planned site in Chicago. Vito Genovese, whose entire ambition for calling the gathering in the first place had been catastrophically undermined by the resulting raid, along with Chicago's own boss Sam Giancana, who had specifically objected to the Apalachin location from the very beginning. Both felt, with considerable and vocal justification, that Magaddino bore direct, personal responsibility for a catastrophe that had cost dozens of powerful men their carefully guarded anonymity in a single afternoon and had triggered a scale of coordinated federal attention that the entire national organization had spent literally decades working to avoid. Sometime after the immediate wave of publicity and legal heat surrounding Apalachin began to gradually subside, an attempt was made directly on Magaddino's life. He was living, by this point, in one of the cluster homes on Dana Drive in Lewiston, the same Mafia Row address, owned collectively by Magaddino and shared with his own sons-in-law, James La Duca, Charles Montana, and Vincent Scrow, all three of them full-made members of his organization, that we opened this entire documentary standing outside of. In 1958, someone threw a live-hand grenade to the window of Magaddino's own home. It failed to detonate. There is a particular, almost unbearable tension embedded in that single fact, one worth sitting with fully. A grenade, thrown with clear and unmistakable intent to kill, landing directly inside the home of a boss in his late 60s, with members of his own family living in the immediate vicinity, and simply inexplicably failing to go off, whether through a manufacturing defect, through some flaw in how it had been armed by whoever threw it, or through nothing more than staggering, inexplicable luck. Stefano Magaddino survived an assassination attempt that, by every reasonable expectation anyone could bring to it, should have ended both his life and his 36-year reign in a single violent instant, inside his own house, mere feet from the people closest to him in the entire world. What both incidents reveal, taken together, the 1936 bombing that took his sister's life, and the 1958 grenade that somehow, against every reasonable expectation, simply didn't detonate, is a peculiar and genuinely precarious nature of the power Magaddino actually held throughout his career. He was, by any fair and reasonable measure available to historians, one of the single most powerful organized crime figures in the entire country, a founding member of the National Commission itself, the controller of criminal territory stretching across two separate nations, a boss whose organization had operated for decades with dramatically more internal discipline and dramatically less visible bloodshed than almost any comparable family anywhere in America, and yet twice real, deliberate violence found its way directly to his own front door. Twice, the specific men who wanted him dead, whether rebellious independent bookmakers in 1936 or furious, aggrieved fellow commission bosses in the bitter aftermath of the Apalachin catastrophe in 1957 and 1958, got close enough to actually make a genuine attempt. The very invisibility that so effectively protected Magaddino from federal prosecution and public exposure offered no meaningful protection whatsoever against enemies who already knew exactly who he was, exactly what he'd done, and exactly where he lived. He ruled across the full span of 50 years, not to the kind of overt, theatrical menace that made men like Al Capone and later John Gotti instantly and permanently recognizable symbols of American organized crime in the public imagination, but through a quieter, far more pervasive and enduring form of fear, the deep, absorbed understanding shared by absolutely everyone in his orbit that Stefano Magaddino did not forgive, did not forget, and eventually, no matter how patiently, always settled every outstanding account in full. The independent bookmakers who killed his sister learned that particular lesson over the course of a single, methodically patient year. It is a lesson that would be reinforced again and again, across the following decades, right up until the very final years of his long reign, when the men closest to him inside his own organization would finally test that patience one time too many, with consequences that would unravel almost everything he had spent half a century so carefully building. But first, before we get to that final unraveling, we have to travel to Apalachin itself, the meeting Magaddino personally arranged, the meeting that exposed the entire American Mafia to the American public for the very first time in its documented history, and the meeting that very nearly ended everything Stefano Magaddino had spent 35 patient, disciplined years constructing. By the fall of 1957, the American Mafia had a serious leadership problem on its hands, and it was precisely the kind of problem that, in this particular world, tends to get resolved with a gun. Albert Anastasia, boss of what would eventually come to be known as the Gambino crime family, a man whose reputation for casual, almost industrial-scale violence had earned him the grim nickname the Lord High Executioner, was assassinated on October 25, 1957, shot dead while sitting in a barber's chair with a hot towel draped over his face inside the barbershop of Manhattan's Park Sheraton Hotel. It was one of the single most brazen mafia hits of the entire decade, carried out in broad daylight in a public commercial establishment, and was widely understood within the underworld itself to be the work of an ambitious, patient rival, Vito Genovese, who had already spent the better part of the preceding year carefully maneuvering his way past his own longtime ally, Frank Costello. Genovese had orchestrated an earlier, ultimately botched assassination attempt against Costello that same spring, a single bullet that only grazed Costello's scalp as he returned home one evening, but that proved more than sufficient to push the older, more cautious boss into voluntary retirement rather than risk facing a determined second attempt on his life. With Costello now safely sidelined and Anastasia freshly dead, Genovese found himself, by the fall of 1957, the singly dominant power broker across New York City's entire underworld, and a man now facing an urgent and delicate political problem entirely of his own making. Seizing supreme power through a carefully engineered assassination is one thing. Successfully compelling the rest of the country's regional mafia leadership to formally recognize and fully legitimize that seizure of power is an entirely different and considerably more delicate undertaking. Genovese wanted a summit, a genuinely national gathering of America's mafia bosses, one large enough and formal enough to functionally ratify his own new position at the very top of New York's underworld hierarchy, settle a series of pressing practical questions about exactly how Anastasia's extensive rackets and territory would now be divided among the surviving leadership, and quietly address a related and uncomfortable matter still hanging over the entire organization. The recent, still, largely unexplained murder of Gambino family consigliere Frank Scalise, another unresolved loose thread from the same extended period of violent internal reshuffling. The original plan, put forward early in the discussions, called for holding this national gathering in Chicago. It was Stefano Magaddino, commission member, trusted arbitrator, the very boss whose entire 5-decade career had been deliberately built around patience, caution, and studied discretion, who personally pushed for an entirely different location, at his direct urging, and over the explicit objections of Chicago's own boss, Sam Giancana, who understandably preferred to host such a consequential meeting on his own home turf. The gathering was relocated instead to rural upstate New York, specifically to private 53-acre estate of Joseph Joe the Barber Barbara, a longtime Magaddino business associate operating out of the small, sleepy town of Apalachin, roughly 200 miles northwest of New York City itself. On paper, at the time, the choice made a considerable amount of practical sense. Barber's estate on McFall Road was private, genuinely rural, and difficult for any outside observer to casually monitor. An 11-room stone manor house surrounded by 5 separate outbuildings, originally built in the late 1940s at an estimated cost of roughly $250,000, financed substantially to the legitimate soft drink bottling business Barber operated as his own personal cover, complete with a genuine, functioning Canada Dry regional distribution franchise. Barber had also secured, through carefully cultivated political connections reaching up into Albany, a district beer distribution license. Precisely the same well-worn playbook of legitimate front businesses layered directly over illegal operations that Magaddino himself had already perfected with his own funeral home decades earlier, back in Niagara Falls. It should, by every reasonable measure available at the time, have been the perfect venue for exactly this kind of sensitive national gathering. Remote, genuinely discreet, and run by a man with years of direct personal experience hosting precisely this sort of event. It was instead about to become the single greatest and most consequential security failure in the entire recorded history of the American Mafia. New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell had been quietly watching Joseph Barber for years, long before anyone else in law enforcement had reason to. He'd personally arrested one of Vito Genovese's own hitmen back in the 1940s and had long suspected, based on years of accumulated small-town observation, that Barber's respectable soft drink distribution business was serving as cover for something considerably less carbonated. On the evening of November 13th, 1957, Croswell and his regular partner, investigator Vincent Vasisco, happened to be at a motel in nearby Vestal, investigating an entirely unrelated bad check complaint, when they overheard something that would go on to change the entire subsequent course of American organized crime history. Barber's 21-year-old son was in the process, at that very moment, of booking a substantial block of hotel rooms for what he casually described to the front desk clerk as a convention of Canada dry man. Croswell's instincts, sharpened over years of quietly watching Barber's activities, told him immediately that this was not, in fact, any ordinary beverage industry gathering. He and Vasisco spent the remainder of that night and the following morning carefully surveilling the motel, Barber's bottling plant, and the Apalachin estate itself, and by early afternoon on November 14th, working alongside two federal treasury agents who had agreed to lend assistance, Croswell pulled his unmarked car up near the property to take a direct look for himself. What he found there confirmed every single suspicion he had quietly carried for years. The entire area in front of Barber's garage was densely packed with expensive automobiles, Cadillacs, Lincolns, Chryslers, Imperials, nearly all of them bearing conspicuously out-of-state license plates. The unmistakable smell of an enormous outdoor barbecue drifted steadily across the property. Barbara, it later emerged during the investigation, had personally ordered roughly 200 pounds of meat for this particular gathering alone. Dozens upon dozens of men in expensive, clearly tailored suits stood scattered around the grounds. Croswell would later describe the scene, in a phrase that has stuck permanently in the historical record ever since, as an assembly of 14-karat hoodlums. An estimated 100 senior mafia figures, bosses, trusted advisors, and personal bodyguards representing organized crime networks from across the entire United States, and from as far away as Cuba and Italy itself, had converged on this single rural property in upstate New York. It was quite possibly the largest single gathering of American Mafia leadership ever assembled in one physical location in the organization's entire history up to that point. Croswell immediately called for reinforcements and ordered roadblocks established on every single road leading away from the estate. What happened over the following hour has since become one of the single most enduring and instantly recognizable images in the entire popular American imagination of organized crime. Dozens of the most powerful criminals in the country, dressed in impeccably tailored suits and expensive alligator shoes, suddenly fleeing on foot through the dense woods surrounding Barber's estate the very moment word spread through the crowd that police had arrived at the property. Some men managed to reach their parked cars in time and drove directly into the roadblocks Croswell's arriving reinforcements had already thrown up across the surrounding roads. Others abandoned their vehicles entirely and simply ran straight into the tree line, crashing through dense underbrush in clothing that cost more, in many cases, than most ordinary Americans earned in an entire month, with several men reportedly discarding loose cash as they ran in a desperate effort to lighten their load or avoid being caught with incriminating sums of money on their person, giving rise, in the decades that followed, to a persistent local legend about buried mob money still, lying somewhere hidden in the woods surrounding Apalachin to this very day. By the end of that long afternoon, somewhere between 58 and 63 men had ultimately been apprehended by police, either caught directly at the hastily established roadblocks or picked up wandering the surrounding countryside in various states of disarray, in at least one memorable case found loitering with studied and unconvincing nonchalance at a nearby train station, dressed unmistakably for a formal business meeting rather than for an impromptu woodland hike. As many as 50 additional men are believed to have successfully escaped entirely, vanishing into surrounding countryside, or slipping past the still-forming police cordon before it could fully close around property. Those men who were successfully caught represented a genuinely staggering cross-section of the entire national mafia leadership structure. Vito Genovese himself, the very man whose ambitions had directly precipitated the entire gathering in the first place. Carlo Gambino, poised at that exact moment to formally inherit Anastasia's substantial criminal empire. Joseph Prophesy, longtime boss of another of New York's 5 families. Joseph Bonanno, Magaddino's own nephew and closest commission ally. Bosses and senior lieutenants representing organized crime families from Los Angeles, from Kansas City, from Philadelphia, from Cleveland, from Dallas, and from points scattered clear across the entire country. Between all of them, the detained men were collectively carrying more than $300,000 in cash on their persons. Of the roughly 50 apprehended men who carried identifiable criminal records, the overwhelming majority had prior convictions, and a striking number had already served substantial time in state or federal prison. Investigators combing through the resulting records would later note an unusually dense concentration of blood relationships among the men present that afternoon. Brothers, cousins, in-laws by marriage, a visible physical demonstration, playing out right there in the muddy fields of upstate New York, of exactly the kind of family-bound loyalty network that had originally shaped Magaddino's own rise from the streets of Castellamare del Golfo decades earlier. Every single man interviewed by police that afternoon offered some variation of the identical cover story. They had simply come to visit their old friend Joseph Barbara, who was said to be recovering from a recent heart attack, and to enjoy a friendly outdoor barbecue together. Not one of them, under sustained questioning, could quite manage to satisfactorily explain why a simple, casual social visit had apparently required this particular, extraordinary concentration of America's single most senior organized crime figures gathered together in one rural backyard on one specific November afternoon. Stefano Magaddino was among the fortunate men who got away entirely. Contemporary reports from the period describe him. The very boss who had personally originated the suggestion of this specific location, fleeing directly to the muddy November woods in his own expensive suit, exactly like the dozens of other panicked men who were ultimately caught that day. He simply had somewhat better luck, or sharper instincts honed over decades of exactly this kind of careful self-preservation, or quite possibly both, and made it safely clear the tightening police cordon entirely, vanishing back toward Buffalo without ever once being formally detained or questioned by authorities. In his own consigliere, John C. Montana, the respected Buffalo businessman and former city councilman who had spent literal decades carefully building the kind of legitimate civic reputation that had given Magaddino's entire organization crucial political cover throughout Buffalo's establishment, was considerably less fortunate. Montana was captured that afternoon along with dozens of other men, and his subsequent public identification as a confirmed Apalachin attendee destroyed. In the span of a single afternoon, the carefully constructed mainstream respectability he had spent decades methodically building throughout western New York. It's a small but genuinely telling detail buried within this much larger story. The one man whose entire professional value to Magaddino's organization rested specifically on his unimpeachable legitimate public standing was precisely, and ironically, the man whose public standing this single event permanently obliterated. The immediate legal consequences flowing directly from Apalachin were, in the end, relatively minor when measured strictly against the scale of the gathering itself. 20 of the men present were eventually formally charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice, essentially lying to federal investigators about the true nature of the gathering, and were convicted in January 1959, receiving fines and prison sentences ranging from 3 to 5 years each. Every single one of those convictions was subsequently overturned on appeal within roughly a year. But the legal outcome of the case was never really the actual point of Apalachin significance, and everyone genuinely involved, on both sides of the law, understood this immediately, even as events were still actively unfolding that November afternoon. The real, lasting damage inflicted by Apalachin was structural in nature, and it proved to be permanent. For decades leading up to this moment, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had publicly and repeatedly denied that anything resembling a coordinated, genuinely national organized crime syndicate actually existed anywhere within the United States. His bureau devoted the overwhelming majority of its available resources and manpower to pursuing suspected domestic communists and other perceived political targets. Within the FBI's own New York field office at the time, some 400 individual agents were formally assigned to hunting suspected subversives, while only a small handful of agents, by comparison, were assigned to organized crime investigations of any kind. Apalachin made that long-standing official institutional position instantly and permanently untenable. It becomes considerably difficult to credibly deny the existence of a coordinated national criminal network after 60 of its single most senior members are caught fleeing together through the woods of the exact same rural property on the exact same afternoon, representing organized crime families from coast to coast, bound together by generations of blood, marriage, and decades of shared criminal enterprise. Within 4 days of the raid itself, Hoover formally ordered the creation of a dedicated new anti-mafia investigative initiative within the Bureau. Not long afterward, the FBI launched what would become known internally as the Top Hoodlum Program and began authorizing wiretaps and sustained surveillance against organized crime figures nationwide on a scale that had simply never before existed within American federal law enforcement. The entire federal government's institutional posture toward the American Mafia changed permanently and irreversibly within the span of a single afternoon in a small upstate New York town that most ordinary Americans had never once heard before and would largely forget again within only a few years. But the vast investigative machinery Apalachin had set permanently in motion would never once forget the men it was now, for the first time in American history, systematically aimed directly at Joseph Barbara, the reluctant estate owner and host whose sprawling rural property had made him a household name for entirely the wrong reasons, watched his own legitimate business empire collapse steadily in the aftermath. He lost his liquor distribution license. He lost his lucrative Canada Dry bottling contract entirely. He was formally indicted on charges of income tax evasion and submitting fraudulent corporate tax filings, and spent the following 2 years actively fending off repeated demands that he testify before a state grand jury about precisely what had actually been discussed at his own estate that fateful November afternoon, using his genuinely declining health as a legal shield against compelled testimony. In 1959, not long after finally being formally compelled to appear before a state Supreme Court commission, he suffered a second, more severe heart attack. He was dead within a matter of weeks, at only 54 years old. And Magaddino, the very boss who had personally suggested the specific location in the first place, the man whose entire career-defining reputation for caution and discretion had defined every major decision of his life up to this point, found himself blamed bitterly and quite openly by his own fellow commission members for what many of them now openly consider the single worst unforced strategic error in the entire modern history of the American Mafia. It was directly in the tense, resentful, and genuinely dangerous aftermath of that widespread blame that the grenade came through his own kitchen window back in Lewiston. Apalachin did not end Stefano Magaddino's long career, but it unmistakably marked the beginning of something that would, over the following decade, prove itself considerably more dangerous to him personally than any single grenade or any single furious rival boss ever could. It marked the true beginning of the FBI's real, sustained, properly resourced national attention that would eventually find its way, quite literally, directly into the walls of Magaddino's own funeral home. In the years immediately following Apalachin, the vast investigative machinery Hoover had so reluctantly set in motion began closing, slowly but with growing precision, directly around Stefano Magaddino. Between 1962 and 1965, the FBI conducted an extensive, entirely illegal bugging operation targeting the Magaddino Memorial Chapel itself, the very funeral home that had given Magaddino both his enduring Underworld nickname and, for the better part of 4 decades, his single most reliable and unimpeachable public cover. The irony embedded in this particular development was almost unbearable when you stopped to consider it fully. The very building Magaddino had specifically constructed to project unimpeachable, boring, small-town respectability, a place where nobody in Niagara Falls thought twice about hushed conversations, black sedans arriving and departing at odd hours, or men in dark suits gathering quietly at unusual times of day, became, over the course of roughly 3 years, the single richest source of investigative intelligence the federal government would ever manage to gather against him in his entire career. Over that period, the hidden bugs generated approximately 76,000 pages of transcribed conversations, capturing arrangements, relationships, and internal organizational dynamics that had never before been documented anywhere with this particular level of granularity and detail. The tragedy of this operation, from the specific perspective of federal prosecutors, and the underlying reason it never once translated into courtroom victory that its sheer scope should logically have produced, was fundamentally procedural in nature. The bugs have been installed entirely without proper judicial warrants, part of a much broader pattern of illegal, unauthorized surveillance the FBI had employed against organized crime figures throughout this entire period, operating in a legal gray zone that Hoover's Bureau had come to treat as an acceptable, if uncomfortable, cost of doing business in an urgent national law enforcement effort. When the governing legal standards for this kind of surveillance tightened considerably in the years that followed, virtually the entire 76,000-page trove of transcripts was ultimately ruled inadmissible in any court proceeding. Federal investigators had, in effect, painstakingly mapped out the entire interior architecture of Magaddino's organization, and then discovered, to their considerable frustration, that they weren't legally permitted to actually use the overwhelming majority of what they had painstakingly learned to convict anyone of anything. But raw intelligence, even intelligence rendered entirely inadmissible in a court of law, retains real practical value well beyond the confines of any single courtroom. It told the FBI, with unprecedented precision, exactly who mattered most within Magaddino's broader organization, exactly how the organization's money actually moved through its various channels, and exactly where the structure's real pressure points and internal vulnerabilities were located. And it quietly set the stage for the next major blow to fall, one that would arrive not through any hidden microphone planted in a funeral parlor, but through a disillusioned man walking directly to the front door of an FBI field office, carrying a genuine grudge and a story he was finally ready to tell. On May 8, 1967, an FBI tip led directly to a raid that instantly, and quite deliberately in the resulting press coverage, evoked the still-fresh memory of the original Apalachin catastrophe a full decade earlier. Acting on specific information that a private stag party, one featuring high-stakes illegal gambling and expected to draw most of the Buffalo family's own senior operational leadership, was scheduled to take place in the basement of Panaro's Snowball Lounge, a bar owned by relatives of the prominent Tadero family. Federal agents moved in and swept up more than 36 men in a single coordinated operation. The press, with an obvious and almost gleeful appetite for the historical echo, immediately dubbed the second raid the Little Apalachin Raid. And by any fair measure, the comparison was genuinely earned. The men swept up that particular night represented an almost complete roll call of the Buffalo family's entire active operating leadership: acting boss Federico Freddy Lupo Randaccio, Capo Josefino, a future underboss in his own right, Daniel Boots Sansonese Sr., a future boss of the organization, Salvatore Sampieri, a future acting underboss, Joseph the Wolf DiCarlo Jr., son of Buffalo's very first documented mafia boss decades earlier, Samuel Frangimore, the former Youngstown, Ohio rackets boss and future family consigliere, and eventually boss in his own right, Pasquale Pat Titters Natarelli, Randaccio's own trusted right-hand man, and the organization's top enforcer, John Camilleri, the family's longtime overseer of labor and union rackets, James Jimmy La Duca, Magaddino's own son-in-law and a documented veteran attendee of the original Apalachin gathering back in 1957, Rosario Roy Carlisi, another Apalachin veteran whose own brother, remarkably, led the Chicago outfit, Victor Randaccio, Freddie's brother and the head of Local 210, and Capo Joseph Tadero Sr., a man who would go on, more than a decade later, to finally reunite the entire fractured family under a single, stable leadership structure. Only 2 men, conspicuously and tellingly, were entirely absent from the long list of arrests that night: Stefano Magaddino himself and his own son, Peter. The specific charges brought against the arrested men that evening, consorting with known criminals, were relatively minor as far as federal charges go, and were eventually dismissed entirely in Buffalo City Court. But the raid inflicted lasting, genuinely irreversible damage on the organization regardless of the ultimate courtroom outcome, and it did so in a way that reveals something quite important about exactly how Magaddino actually governed his sprawling organization behind the scenes. When word eventually reached him that his own top lieutenant, Randaccio, had reacted to his own arrest by flying into an uncontrolled rage and openly cursing out the arresting officers on the scene, and that Randaccio's own carefully cultivated political connections, the very network of tipped-off relationships specifically designed to provide advance warning of exactly this kind of federal raid, had completely and catastrophically failed to function when it actually mattered. Magaddino's fury, by every surviving account from the period, was considerable and unambiguous. This was precisely the kind of visible, undignified public spectacle of senior mafia leadership being handcuffed and hauled into police custody in full view of the community that Magaddino had spent 45 patient years methodically building his entire operational philosophy specifically around avoiding at all costs. Randaccio, standing with his own boss, never fully recovered from this single humiliating episode. And within only a few short weeks, a far more serious and existentially threatening development than one embarrassing gambling arrest was already quietly taking shape in the background. One that would ultimately remove both Randaccio and Nattarelli from the streets of Buffalo entirely for the better part of 2 full decades. In December 1964, a Buffalo stick-up man named Pasquale Patti Calabrese carried out a genuinely brazen, broad daylight robbery of Buffalo's own City Hall building, a crime bold enough and public enough that earned him a certain grudging local notoriety even before anyone could have predicted its far larger historical consequences. He was eventually caught and convicted, and while serving out a 5-year sentence for the crime, something began to shift slowly and irreversibly inside him, a growing corrosive resentment toward both the organization he had spent years working for and the aging boss who ultimately ran it. Calabrese had watched, over his years inside the organization, as Magaddino consistently and coldly abandoned men the very moment law enforcement finally got hold of them. He had personally watched it happen to the Aguisi brothers, Alberto and Vito Aguisi, narcotics traffickers whose lucrative drug business Magaddino had quietly taxed and discreetly protected for years, right up until the exact moment local police finally caught up with them, at which point Magaddino's protection and personal interest in their welfare evaporated instantly and entirely. While out on bail awaiting his own trial, Alberto Aguisi had reportedly threatened to go directly to the FBI with everything he personally knew about Magaddino's broader organization unless the aging boss intervened decisively to help him and his brother. Magaddino did not intervene. Within a matter of days, Alberto Aguisi's body was discovered badly burned and missing roughly 40 pounds of flesh that had been methodically sliced away from it while he was reportedly still alive, a killing carried out with a level of calculated, deliberate brutality clearly intended as an unmistakable message to anyone else within the organization who might consider making the same kind of threat. Calabrese, sitting alone in his own prison cell, understood exactly what that particular message had meant, and understood, with growing clarity, exactly how little real loyalty ever actually flowed downward from Magaddino toward the men who took the genuine physical risks on behalf, year after year. He also understood something the unfortunate Aguisi brothers themselves had apparently never fully grasped. He had never been formally inducted as a full-made member of the family, which meant the sacred code of omerta bound him with somewhat less absolute, less inescapable force than it bound the men positioned directly above him in the organizational hierarchy. Working through a sympathetic Buffalo police sergeant named Sam Jambroni, Calabrese eventually reached out to federal prosecutors, specifically to the newly formed Organized Crime and Racketeering Section, a special federal unit created under Attorney General Robert Kennedy, specifically to break through the near-total lack of coordination that had long plagued the dozens of separate federal agencies then nominally investigating organized crime cases across the country, largely in isolation from one another. On February 27, 1967, in a carefully arranged secret meeting, Calabrese sat down with federal investigators and, for the very first time in the entire documented history of the Buffalo crime family, began naming names, laying out, in a level of granular operational detail federal investigators had genuinely never before had access to from a true organizational insider, the precise structure, the key personnel, and the specific ongoing criminal activities of Magaddino's entire organization. He could not, notably and tellingly, directly implicate Magaddino himself in any specific criminal act. The aging boss's decades of careful insulation through layers of intermediaries and deliberate cutouts held firm even here, even under this unprecedented level of insider cooperation. But he gave federal prosecutors precisely what they needed to pursue the two men who were actually running Buffalo's day-to-day criminal rackets on the ground. Randaccio, whom Calabrese and other investigators strongly believed to be directly responsible for Alberto Aguisi's brutal torture murder, and Natarelli, the notoriously ice-pick-wielding enforcer who had long served as Randaccio's most trusted right hand. The organization's retaliation was swift and severe. The very moment Magaddino's people learned that Calabrese was actively cooperating with federal authorities, they immediately began hunting for both him and his girlfriend, aggressively questioning friends, extended family members, and in one small but genuinely telling detail that captures the sheer methodical thoroughness of a determined mafia intimidation campaign, even interrogating Calabrese's own personal barber, searching relentlessly for any possible thread that might lead them back to his exact location. Calabrese's girlfriend and her young children were quickly relocated onto a secure military base for their own protection. Calabrese himself was moved to a secure federal facility down in Texas that agents privately nicknamed, with a certain grim institutional humor, the Valachi Suite, a direct reference to Joseph Valachi, the earlier landmark mafia informant whose own 1963 Senate testimony had first introduced the American public at large to the term Cosa Nostra. As the scheduled trial date steadily approached, Magaddino's organization grew bold enough, in a startling and dangerous escalation, to begin calling Federal Strike Force members directly at their private home telephone numbers, explicitly threatening their lives and the lives of their families. In direct response, according to multiple surviving accounts from the period, two members of the Federal Strike Force team, Sergeant Jambroni himself, the same officer who had originally brought Calabrese's cooperation offered prosecutors, and a former agent of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, drove out together to Magaddino's own home in Niagara Falls and personally knocked on his front door. When the elderly boss himself answered, one of the two men reportedly forced the barrel of his own service revolver directly into Magaddino's mouth and delivered an unambiguous, deeply personal warning. If one more threatening phone call came in, or if anyone connected to his organization ever attempted to harm a single strike force member or any member of their families again, they would personally return and kill him where he stood. According to these same accounts, the organized harassment campaign stopped almost immediately afterward. On June 29, 1967, federal agents and local officers formally deputized as United States Marshals arrested Randaccio, Natarelli, and several of their close associates, Sam Pieri, Nicholas Rizzo, Stephen Chino, and Daniel Domino, on federal charges directly connected to a sprawling robbery conspiracy stretching from West Virginia all the way to California. Calabrese's testimony, delivered carefully and methodically over following months of legal proceedings, became the essential evidentiary backbone of the prosecution's entire case against all five defendants. On December 11, 1967, Randaccio and Natarelli were formally convicted on federal conspiracy charges. Both men were sentenced to 20 years each in federal prison. Chino and Domino were convicted as well, though on somewhat different charges. Pieri, notably and significantly for everything that would follow, was fully acquitted, a distinction that would prove to matter enormously in internal power struggles still to come within the organization. For the Buffalo family as a whole, this outcome represented nothing short of a genuine decapitation. Randaccio, Magaddino's own acting boss, the man who had been carefully positioned, through both seniority and reputation, as the single most likely eventual successor to the aging Magaddino himself, was now gone, removed from Buffalo's active underworld for what would ultimately amount to 12 full years behind bars before his eventual parole in 1979, after which he never again wielded any meaningful influence within the organization's ongoing affairs. Natarelli, his loyal enforcer and trusted right hand, was gone right alongside him, sentenced to the identical 20-year term. The Buffalo family had just lost, in the span of a single dramatic federal prosecution built almost entirely on the testimony of one disillusioned soldier, its entire operational command structure directly beneath the boss himself. And into that sudden, gaping organizational vacuum, Magaddino made a decision that would go on to prove itself one of the single most consequential misjudgments of his entire 50-year career. He elevated his own son, Peter, directly into the critically important role of acting underboss. It was a decision rooted firmly in the oldest and most instinctive impulse in all of organized crime, Keep real power carefully contained within the bloodline. Trust family above absolutely everyone and everything else. And was about to collide, catastrophically and irreversibly, with a quietly ongoing FBI investigation that was already, at that very moment, circling directly around Peter Magaddino's own personal household finances. Peter Magaddino's sudden elevation to the position of acting underboss did not sit well at all with the capos now positioned directly beneath him, men who had each spent decades personally earning their own respective positions through years of accumulated criminal apprenticeship, genuine risk, and consistently demonstrated loyalty, now watching helplessly as the boss's own son leapfrogged directly into command largely, as far as they could see, on the strength of his family name alone. It was precisely the kind of purely dynastic succession that institutions like the National Commission itself had originally been structurally designed, in part, to actively guard against. Real organizational power was always supposed to flow primarily toward demonstrated competence and earned respect, not simply and automatically toward shared blood. Compounding this growing internal resentment considerably, in 1969 explicit word came down directly from Stefano Magaddino that the family's capos would henceforth be required to surrender a noticeably smaller share of their own individual criminal earnings, kicking up substantially more cash to the organization's central leadership, which functionally meant, in practice, directly to Peter, at a moment when the family's entire senior leadership had only recently been gutted by a single devastating federal prosecution, when morale among the organization's remaining capos was already genuinely fragile and uncertain. Magaddino's chosen response was to tighten the financial screws even further rather than loosen them in a gesture of reassurance. It did not endear Peter to the men now nominally serving under his command, and it did not, in equal measure, endear the aging boss himself to a rank-and-file membership that was beginning, for the very first time in nearly 5 decades of his leadership, to genuinely and openly question his judgment. Money had, in fact, become an increasingly open and visible point of tension between Magaddino and his own lieutenants throughout this entire turbulent period. As the twin Randaccio and Natarelli convictions continued to rattle the organization from top to bottom, and as rival factions began quietly pulling territory and gambling revenue away from Magaddino's own direct central control, the aging boss began repeatedly telling his own men that overall revenues were down significantly, that the family could no longer reasonably afford the customary financial gestures that had, for literal generations, helped cement genuine loyalty at every single level of the organizational hierarchy, including, most pointedly and most damagingly of all, the annual Christmas bonuses that capos and ordinary soldiers alike had long come to expect as a basic, minimal acknowledgement of their labor and their ongoing personal risk on the organization's collective behalf. His men believed him. There was, at the time, no particularly obvious reason not to. Magaddino had personally controlled and managed the organization's finances in an entirely opaque manner for nearly 50 consecutive years, and virtually nobody positioned beneath him possessed any genuine visibility whatsoever into what the family's true underlying revenues and reserves actually were. They were about to learn, in what would prove to be the single most humiliating way imaginable, that they had all been deliberately, systematically lied to. The specific chain of events that would ultimately crack open Magaddino's carefully hidden personal finances began, almost absurdly, with a stolen collection of fine art. In August 1968, burglars broke into the rural Pennsylvania home of a wealthy and notably eccentric art collector named T. Edward Hanley, while he slept undisturbed in his own bed, making off cleanly with 14 separate paintings, including significant works by internationally recognized artists such as Renoir and Picasso, along with 2 additional sculptural pieces, in a heist whose collective value was later estimated at roughly $1.3 million. The operation had been carried out primarily by 2 men connected loosely to the Buffalo family's broader criminal orbit, Russell DeChico and Louis Marakis, and it bore what one investigating New York State Police captain later described to reporters, with a certain professional understatement, as unmistakably possessing a definite Cosa and Nostra flavor. The burglars' fatal strategic mistake lay in badly underestimating exactly who and what they were actually dealing with. Hanley's personal collection was so specialized and so instantly recognizable to anyone with genuine expertise in fine art provenance that essentially no legitimate art dealer and no genuine black market buyer anywhere in the world could plausibly move the stolen works without triggering immediate and unavoidable exposure. Compounding this fundamental problem considerably, Hanley's own wife, Tula, categorically refused to simply grieve the loss quietly and privately. She went directly and aggressively to the press instead, publicly offering a substantial cash reward for the safe, no questions asked return of the stolen paintings, while correctly and pointedly insisting to reporters covering the story that this particular theft had clearly been the work of rank amateurs rather than genuine professional art. Thieves. Her instincts, as it turned out, proved entirely sound. The burglars, left holding a collection of stolen art they simply couldn't move or sell through any conventional channel, eventually fell for a carefully constructed FBI sting operation, an undercover federal agent posing convincingly as a corrupt, well-connected art dealer that ultimately led investigators directly to the stolen paintings themselves, recovered fully intact and undamaged near an isolated oil shack in rural Pennsylvania. For federal investigators who had already spent years painstakingly building intelligence against the Buffalo family through the illegal Magaddino Memorial Chapel wiretaps, the accidentally botched Hanley burglary opened up an entirely unexpected new investigative thread, a live, ongoing case that led, through an evolving chain of cooperating informants and careful financial tracing, directly toward a considerably larger and more consequential target, an extensive illegal horse race betting operation directly connected to Peter Magaddino himself. In November 1968, federal agents finally obtained a formal search warrant for Peter Magaddino's own home as part of their expanding illegal betting investigation. What they discovered there did not merely advance the broader case against the family. It detonated it entirely. Hidden carefully behind a secret concealed door, agents ultimately recovered a genuinely staggering quantity of cash. Figures cited across various contemporary and historical accounts range from roughly $473,000 up to as much as $500,000 in total, discovered stashed away deep inside the wall cavities and attic spaces of the house itself. This single discovery immediately gave federal investigators formal probable cause to expand their active search directly to Stefano Magaddino's own personal residence as well. And the sheer timing of this particular revelation could not possibly have been more devastating for the aging boss's remaining credibility within his own organization. This was, after all, the exact same period during which Magaddino had been personally, repeatedly telling his own capos that money throughout the organization was genuinely tight, that the family simply couldn't afford the customary Christmas bonuses and other financial gestures as men had relied upon and expected for literal decades. Now, sitting inside his own son's attic, federal agents had just pulled out nearly $500,000 in unaccounted, undeclared cash that Magaddino himself had apparently never once mentioned to a single soul within his own organization. For an organization built, at its very structural core, on trust and hierarchical loyalty flowing both upward and downward through every level of the chain of command, this particular discovery was catastrophic in a way that no single arrest, no prison sentence, and no piece of ordinary legal jeopardy could ever have possibly matched. It wasn't merely that Magaddino had been caught concealing money from federal tax authorities. After all, essentially every organized crime boss operating anywhere in America hid substantial money from the government as a basic matter of operational necessity. It was instead that he'd been caught directly and unambiguously lying to the very men whose continued loyalty and obedience his entire remaining authority ultimately depended upon. The carefully cultivated myth of the disciplined, honorable Sicilian Don, the wise patriarch who genuinely took care of his own men even while demanding absolute obedience and loyalty in return, cracked wide open in a Lewiston attic, right in front of federal agents holding valid search warrants, and word of exactly what had been found there spread through Buffalo's entire underworld almost immediately afterward. Which brings us, finally, back around to that kitchen floor. When federal agents subsequently arrived at Stefano Magaddino's own personal home to execute their own search warrant that same November, the very scene this entire documentary opened with, the 77-year-old boss suddenly collapsed to the floor, one hand clutching desperately at his chest, apparently suffering a genuine heart attack, directly in front of the arresting federal officers. It was not, by nearly every surviving account from the period, entirely genuine. Magaddino did, in fact, suffer from real and well-documented heart trouble. This was an established, verifiable medical fact about his health well before this particular incident ever occurred. But a physician summoned directly to the scene that day examined him carefully on the spot and determined, with reasonable medical confidence, that whatever exactly was happening on that kitchen floor did not actually match the physical symptoms of a genuine cardiac event. Stefano Magaddino, in the considered judgment of the examining doctor, was performing. He was arrested regardless of the doctor's assessment. But in one final, almost perfectly characteristic demonstration of exactly the strategic patience that had quietly defined his entire 5-decade career, Magaddino's legal team went on to spend the following several years successfully and repeatedly delaying his scheduled trial, citing again and again his genuinely fragile, well-documented cardiac condition as sufficient legal grounds for postponement after postponement after postponement. It worked exactly as intended. Stefano Magaddino, despite having been caught essentially red-handed at the very center of a major federal investigation that had simultaneously exposed both a substantial hidden fortune and transparently fabricated medical emergency in the very same afternoon, never once spent a single day of his life actually confined behind bars or any of it. He had, once again, successfully avoided the specific fate that had already claimed so many of his own contemporaries throughout organized crime, not through calculated violence, and not through the desperate, frightened loyalty of underlings terrified of the consequences of betrayal, but through the exact same patient procedural, almost bureaucratic discipline that had reliably protected him ever since the day he first arrived in Buffalo, wanted for questioning, all the way back in 1922. But this particular time, the resulting victory was fundamentally hollow, and everyone positioned around within the organization understood this immediately and completely. The empire itself, regardless of any single individual legal outcome, was already visibly and irreversibly coming apart at the seams. Between 1968 and 1969, the full accumulated weight of the damage, the devastating loss of both Randaccio and Nattarelli to lengthy federal prison sentences, the deeply humiliating public exposure of Magaddino's hidden personal fortune alongside his transparently fabricated heart attack, the growing, corrosive resentment among the family's capos over Peter Magaddino's purely dynastic promotion, and the accompanying financial squeeze that came directly alongside it, finally broke open into fully organized, open internal rebellion. A genuine dissident faction began steadily coalescing throughout this period, drawing together men who held legitimate, well-founded grievances against the organization's Niagara Falls-based leadership, and who had watched, with steadily growing contempt, as an aging boss they no longer fully trusted continued nonetheless to demand absolute obedience from below while offering visibly less and less intangible return. Salvatore Sampieri, the one senior figure who had been fully acquitted in the devastating 1967 federal prosecution that had otherwise destroyed both Randaccio and Nattarelli, emerged as a natural rallying point for this growing rebellion, drawing significant active support from men, including Josefino, and from Frank Valeni, who had by this point established a genuinely independent and increasingly powerful base of operations over in Rochester. In July 1969, this organized rebel faction formally convened a meeting and collectively made a decision that would have seemed almost genuinely unthinkable barely a decade earlier. They voted, as a group, to formally stop recognizing Stefano Magaddino as boss of the Buffalo family entirely. It was not, notably, a coup that unfolded through open gunfire in the streets, in the dramatic style of the earlier Castellammarese war that had first delivered a young Magaddino to Buffalo nearly 5 decades before. It was instead, in a strange and almost fitting historical echo of Magaddino's own long-preferred methods of operation, a quiet, procedural, almost bureaucratic revolt, a formal vote taken, a deliberate withdrawal of official recognition, a fracturing of the once unified organization into several genuinely competing factions. The Pieri group, loyal to the organization's older DeCarlo lineage, a separate faction steadily gathering around the ascendant Tadero family, and Frank Valeni's largely independent Rochester organization, now operating with substantial autonomy of its own. Crucially, the National Commission itself, the very governing body Magaddino had personally helped found back in 1932, the same body whose formal legitimacy had underwritten and protected his own personal authority for 37 consecutive years, pointedly declined to formally recognize this Rochester-led rebellion. As far as the commission was concerned, in strictly formal organizational terms, Stefano Magaddino remained the sole legitimate boss of the entire Buffalo family. When Fino later attempted to openly act as though he personally held the boss's full authority, he was formally summoned before the National Commission in 1972 and told, in no uncertain terms whatsoever, that Magaddino unambiguously remained boss, and that his own faction needed to stand down immediately and completely. But formal recognition granted by a distant commission sitting 400 miles away in New York City could not realistically undo the practical, day-to-day reality steadily unfolding on the actual ground in Buffalo itself. Much of Magaddino's genuine operational structure, the specific men who actually ran the day-to-day rackets, who personally collected the money, who genuinely commanded the loyalty of the soldiers positioned beneath them, already effectively defected to the Pieri camp in practical fact, whatever the Commission's official standing continued to formally say on paper. Stefano Magaddino, the longest-tenured boss in the entire recorded history of the American Mafia, ultimately spent the final years of his long life as the boss, at least on paper, of a family that the national leadership continued to insist still formally belonged to him, even as, in the actual streets of Buffalo itself, that same family had already visibly and irreversibly split into pieces he no longer genuinely controlled in any meaningful practical sense. Stefano Magaddino died of a heart attack, a genuine one this time, at his own home on July 19, 1974. He was 82 years old. There was, on this final occasion, no doctor standing over him to quietly declare a performance. He had led the Buffalo crime family for 52 consecutive years, longer than any single boss in the entire recorded history of the American Mafia, a record that has never once been surpassed by any subsequent boss anywhere in the country. He had achieved this while personally helping to found the National Commission itself, while surviving a bombing that had taken his own sister's life and a hand grenade attack that, by any reasonable calculation available to historians, should also have killed him outright. He had personally orchestrated the single largest gathering of mafia leadership in documented American history, and then watched it collapse, almost immediately, into the most consequential law enforcement disaster his entire criminal world had ever experienced, and walked away from the smoking wreckage of Apalachin with both his personal freedom and his organizational position fully intact. He had been caught, in the very final active years of his long life, systematically hoarding cash he had personally sworn to his own men simply did not exist, and had subsequently faked a heart attack directly in front of federal agents specifically to buy himself additional time, and even that final, desperate gambit, in the end, had genuinely worked exactly as intended, unlike John Gotti, who would go on to rise to considerable national fame and infamy in the decade immediately following Magaddino's own death, and who would ultimately die inside a federal prison hospital, publicly humiliated by precisely the kind of relentless visibility Magaddino had spent his entire career carefully avoiding, and unlike so very many of his own contemporaries throughout organized crime, who ended their respective careers sitting in courtrooms, living out their final years in forced exile or lying in coffins arranged by their own bitter rivals, Stefano Magaddino died peacefully in his own bed, inside his own house, entirely on his own terms. It stands, in its own genuinely dark and complicated way, as perhaps the single most complete vindication imaginable of the operating philosophy he had deliberately built his entire adult life around. Survive, above all else, by staying invisible, and simply let the flashier, more famous men absorb both the headlines and the bullets that were ultimately meant for someone considerably more visible than you. But the hard-won peace Magaddino had died with did not extend, even briefly, to the fractured organization he ultimately left behind him. The deep factional splits that had already fractured his real operational authority in the final years of his life exploded almost immediately into open, deadly street conflict the moment he was gone. Within only a few short weeks, John Camilleri, the veteran labor and union racketeer who had thrown his own considerable support behind the rebel Pieri faction years earlier, and who by 1974 was actively maneuvering for greater personal power alongside Josefino and elements of the independent Rochester organization, was murdered on May 8, 1974, in a targeted killing that immediately stripped Fino of much of his remaining street-level power and handed effective control of Camilleri's own operating crew directly over to Daniel Sansonese Sr. It was precisely the kind of visible, destabilizing gang violence that Magaddino had spent 5 full decades successfully suppressing within his own organization, breaking out fully into the open the very moment his own personal restraining authority was finally, permanently removed from the entire underlying equation. Sam Frangimore, the former Youngstown Rackets boss who had steadily risen to the organization's consigliere ranks over the preceding years, emerged in the immediate aftermath of Magaddino's death as a newly recognized boss. Though the precise, genuinely tangled sequence of competing acting bosses, rival factional leaders, and various forms of commission-sanctioned authority extending to the remainder of the 1970s and well into the early 1980s remains, even today among historians, who specialize in this particular period, one of the considerably murkier chapters in the entire family's documented history. What remains genuinely clear, however, is that the unified, disciplined, single-boss organizational structure Magaddino had personally maintained for half a century did not survive his own death fully intact. The Buffalo family spent the years immediately following 1974 functioning as a fractured, deeply factionalized organization. The older Pieri DiCarlo lineage, the steadily emerging Tadero faction, and Frank Valenti's largely independent Rochester operation, all actively competing for territory, resources, and organizational legitimacy within the sudden power vacuum Magaddino's death had permanently opened up. It would ultimately take more than an entire decade for the Buffalo family to finally find a leader genuinely capable of doing what Magaddino himself had once done so effectively, successfully pulling a badly fractured, deeply feuding regional organization back together under a single, stable, unified authority. That particular man turned out to be Joseph Tadero Sr., known within the organization, with characteristic Buffalo bluntness, by the nickname Lead Pipe Joe, a longtime capo who had personally been present at the original Little Apalachin raid all the way back in 1967, who had successfully weathered the devastating Randaccio Natarelli convictions, the divisive Rochester Revolt, and the chaotic, often violent post-Magaddino power struggles of the mid-1970s, and who gradually emerged over the course of the 1980s as a figure genuinely capable of finally reuniting the family's various competing factions under his own leadership, under Tadero Sr.'s steady leadership. The Buffalo family regained a meaningful measure of the internal stability and operational discipline that had originally defined Magaddino's own 52-year reign, even as the broader American Mafia nationally entered a period of genuinely unprecedented federal legal pressure. Sweeping RICO prosecutions, increasingly aggressive dedicated FBI task forces, and a sustained wave of high-profile convictions that systematically dismantled much of New York. City's own storied five-family leadership structure throughout the 1980s and well into the 1990s. Tadero Sr. led the reunified Buffalo family all the way until his eventual formal retirement in 2006, at which point active leadership passed directly to his own son, Joseph Big Joe Tadero Jr., a generational succession that, in its own quiet and considerably more stable way, deliberately echoed the same dynastic instincts that had once driven the aging Magaddino to elevate his own son Peter decades earlier, though under circumstances considerably more institutionally stable than those that had originally greeted Peter Magaddino's own controversial promotion back in 1967. According to the United States Department of Justice's own official assessment, Joseph Tadero Jr. has been formally identified as a more recent acknowledged boss of the Buffalo crime family, a designation that itself quietly confirms something genuinely remarkable. More than a full century after Angelo Palmieri first organized Buffalo's earliest underworld structure, and half a century after Stefano Magaddino's own death, the underlying organization he originally built still persists in some recognizable form. Perhaps the single most striking and durable testament to Magaddino's original foundational strategic decision, the Commission's landmark 1931 division of Canadian Criminal Territory that handed Ontario directly to Buffalo and Quebec directly to the Banana Organization, is simply how remarkably durable that particular cross-border architecture has proven to be decades after the man who originally negotiated it had already passed away. Periodic FBI intelligence reports issued over the intervening decades have, at various points, characterized the Buffalo family as significantly diminished or largely inactive as a meaningful criminal enterprise, a fading regional relic left over from an earlier era in which American organized crime's genuine center of gravity had long since shifted decisively elsewhere toward newer and more visible criminal enterprises. Canadian law enforcement authorities, working independently across the border, have told a somewhat different and more complicated story. a sustained investigation known as Project Otermans, specifically examining ongoing organized crime connections across the Toronto and Hamilton underworld, found continuing, substantial evidence of exactly the kind of enduring cross-border relationships Magaddino himself had first carefully cultivated nearly a full century earlier. In November 2017, Canadian authorities formally arrested Giuseppe and Domenico Violi on serious narcotics trafficking charges. Two men with long-documented, well-established ties to the broader Buffalo organized crime network operated within a criminal corridor directly linking Hamilton, Toronto, Buffalo, and Montreal that traces its underlying institutional lineage directly back to the original territorial arrangement Magaddino and his own nephew Joseph Bonanno first struck together at the very earliest formal meetings of a national commission back in 1931. As one former Hamilton-based undercover organized crime investigator put it in public comments made following the 2017 Violi arrests, nobody could honestly say with any real certainty exactly how the ongoing balance of power within that particular cross-border underworld would ultimately continue to play out over time. But one thing, in his own considered professional assessment, remained reliably and consistently true regardless of any other factor. Buffalo, in some enduring form, would always continue to have a genuine say in matters unfolding north of the border. That, in the very end, is arguably the truest and most complete measure of exactly what Stefano Magaddino actually built over the course of his long and remarkable life. Not simply a single dramatic criminal empire that rose and inevitably fell along with one man's fame, the way Al Capone's Chicago operation or John Gotti's later Gambino family would eventually and permanently come to be remembered by history, but genuine, lasting infrastructure, a carefully built network of relationships, established smuggling and trafficking routes, and formal territorial understanding so deeply and thoroughly embedded within the underlying underworld economy of an entire international border region that they ultimately managed to outlast his own most trusted lieutenants, outlast his own son's brief and troubled tenure, outlast Magaddino's own death by fully half a century, and in some diminished but still recognizably persistent form, appear to genuinely continue on to this very day. For 52 remarkable years, Stefano Magaddino ran one of the single most powerful, most geographically expansive criminal organizations in the entire history of American organized crime, and he managed to do it almost entirely without ever becoming genuinely famous. While Al Capone's own face ended up gracing the cover of Time magazine, and while John Gotti would go on to earn himself the enduring public nickname, the Dapper Don, for his impeccably tailored suits and his obvious taste for television cameras and press attention, Magaddino quietly built an empire stretching from Ohio all the way to Ontario and into Quebec, sat for fully 37 years as a founding member of the very body that formally governed organized crime nationwide, and largely, remarkably, got away with essentially all of it, not despite his own carefully cultivated anonymity, but precisely and directly because of it. That is the single theme this entire story keeps circling patiently back to, again and again, in bombing after bombing, in raid after raid, in every quiet arrangement carefully made inside a funeral parlor that the FBI eventually had to secretly bug for 3 straight years just to even begin understanding what was actually happening there in the first place. Genuine, lasting power, the specific kind that actually endures across generations, rarely if ever announces itself loudly. It doesn't fundamentally need headlines. It doesn't need a colorful nickname splashed dramatically across a tabloid front page. It survives quietly, generation after generation, precisely by making absolutely certain that almost nobody standing outside the room ever fully understands what is genuinely happening inside it, until, many decades later, historians and documentary researchers find themselves digging carefully through 76,000 pages of ultimately inadmissible federal transcripts, just to begin piecing together what everyone actually operating inside Buffalo's underworld had already quietly known and understood the entire time. Stefano Magaddino built exactly that kind of power, and across the full length of an entire human lifetime, in a single sweeping story that stretched all the way from a blood vendetta killing in Sicily back in 1916, to a founding seat on America's most powerful criminal council, through bombs and grenades and a stampede to the November woods of upstate New York, to a final FBI raid unfolding in his own kitchen in 1968. He managed to make absolutely certain that almost nobody outside his own carefully guarded world ever really learned his name at all. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, genuinely, thank you. This was a long journey, and this particular story deserved to be told properly, in full, without cutting a single corner. Drop a comment down below and tell me honestly which figure in this entire story surprised you the most. Magaddino himself, Patty Calabrese, John C. Montana, or somebody else entirely that caught your attention along the way. And if you want more deep dives like this one, the crime family's history never quite gave the full credit they were actually due. Hit subscribe, hit like, and share this with somebody in your life who genuinely needs to hear the story of the most powerful American boss almost nobody ever heard of.